I spent hours grinding the hood all the way to Lord Proficiency. And honestly, by the end of it, I wasn't sure if I actually liked this character anymore. Don't get me wrong, the hood is one of the more interesting characters Marvel Rivals has added recently, and I absolutely love that NetEase is giving relatively unknown Marvel characters the spotlight they deserve. But after playing him enough to actually understand his strengths, weaknesses, and just how miserable solo tanking can be, I have some opinions. So today, I want to go over the Hood's kit, his comic origins, how Marvel Rivals completely reworks his story, and finally, my honest thoughts on the character, what I think works, what doesn't, and what I change. So let's get right into it. The Hood has a pretty straightforward primary fire. He's dual wielding his pistols and using them as his main source of damage. He's also got a melee attack, but honestly, I barely ever used it. The dual pistols immediately reminded me of Deadpool, which isn't exactly surprising considering both characters are heavily focused around firing two handguns. Where the Hood starts to get more interesting is his demonic energy. While you're firing your pistols and dealing damage, you're building up this resource bar. Once you've got enough energy, you can activate his first ability and enter his half demon state. Before that, though, you've got a personal shield that lasts for roughly a second and a half. It's simple, but that's actually something I really appreciate about the Hood. There's not a million things you need to keep track of. Build your energy, use your shield, keep applying pressure, and eventually you're going to enter your stronger state. Then we've got his wall shield, the Abyssal Veil. This creates a barrier that reduces damage of incoming projectiles, and also interacts with healing passing through it, decreasing that as well. As far as wall shields go, I'd say out of all the ones we have in game, it's okay. It's not something I ever felt was completely useless, but it also never gave me that feeling of, alright, if I use this ability, it's going to completely change the fight. It gets the job done. And then we have Void Walk. This is basically the Hood's mobility and escape tool. Activating it gives you demon energy, and you can use it either to get out of bad situations or to chase down an enemy. What's really cool is that while you're in your half demon state, Void Walk actually helps refill your demon energy. So if you're managing your abilities correctly, you can stay in that state longer, continuing to soak up the damage and keep firing. And that's basically the Hood's core gameplay loop. Pretty simple, which for me is actually a really good thing. Now with his core gameplay out of the way, I really want to take a moment to talk about his two newest team-ups. The first is New Moon Shadow with Moon Knight. This changes your wall shield, allowing it to detonate and deal damage while applying a healing reduction. Enemies passing through it can also be blinded, and they get a damage stack. And then there's Chaos Collision with Scarlet Witch. This gives the Hood a new ability that creates a small area of effect that deals stacking damage and applies healing reduction. You can also reactivate it to teleport yourself directly to the center of that area. Honestly, I think these team-ups fit the Hood pretty well thematically. They give him some additional utility without completely changing how the character plays. But to really understand why the Hood is the way he is, we need to talk about where Parker Robbins comes from. In the comics, the Hood is actually a pretty interesting character. As we know already, his real name is Parker Robbins, and unlike a lot of Marvel villains, he didn't start out as some insanely powerful supervillain. He was basically just your average criminal. Parker became fascinated with superheroes after witnessing Daredevil fighting Elektra when he was younger. Eventually, though, he followed in his family's criminal footsteps, partially because of his family's circumstances and his desire to support his sick mother. Then, during a robbery, Parker encountered what he believed was a dead demon called Nasanti. He stole the demon's hood and boots, thinking they might be worth something. He quickly discovered that these weren't exactly normal pieces of clothing. The boots allowed him to fly, while the hood gave him invisibility and other supernatural abilities. And that's when Parker Robbins became the Hood. But here's where things get really interesting. The Hood's powers are eventually revealed to be connected to Dormammu, the ruler of the Dark Dimension. And Parker doesn't exactly use these powers to become a hero. He uses them to build his own criminal empire. Over time, he becomes a major player in Marvel's criminal underworld, eventually becoming a powerful enough criminal leader to lead his own group of supervillains and even become involved with Norman Osborn during the Dark Reign era. So, the comic version of the Hood is essentially a guy who was already ambitious and willing to break the law. Then he got supernatural power and decided, why should I stop there? And that's actually where Marvel Rivals takes a very different direction. Now, for Marvel Rivals, they completely reworked Parker Robin's origin. Instead of simply being a criminal who steals a demon's clothing, this version of Parker starts off with a much stronger belief in justice. When he was younger, Parker actually looked up to Captain America. His father, Arthur Robbins, worked in construction and became entangled with Kingpin's influence. Parker grows up watching corruption affect his family. His father gets imprisoned, and his mother unfortunately becomes increasingly ill. And eventually, Parker's faith in the traditional heroes he once admired starts falling apart. And then, things get even worse. Parker witnesses the death of his Captain America and learns that his father has also been killed. At this point, Parker essentially decides that the system isn't going to save anyone. So he'll do it himself. Problem is that his definition of justice becomes increasingly violent. Eventually, during a prison escape, Parker falls into Kingpin's private vault, and that's where he finds the Hood. But this isn't the same Hood from the comics. In Marvel Rivals, the cloak is connected to Oblivion, a cosmic entity associated with nothingness and the end of all existence. Oblivion offers Parker the power he's been searching for, and Parker takes it. So while the comic version is more of a power-hungry criminal who uses supernatural abilities to climb the criminal underworld, the Rivals version is much more tragic. He's someone who started with genuine beliefs that the world could be better, and then became so consumed by revenge that he was willing to become the very thing he hated. I actually really like that change. It gives the Hood a lot more emotional weight than I expected from a character whose main gimmick is basically a guy with a magic cloak and guns. So now that we've covered what he can do and who he is, let's get into what I actually liked about playing him. First, I really like that the Hood is a relatively unknown character. Marvel has hundreds upon hundreds of characters, and I think it's great when the game gives someone who isn't Spider-Man, Wolverine, or even Iron Man a chance to be in the spotlight. And after learning more about his story, I think the Hood actually deserved the opportunity. I also really like how many different ways you can actually play him. During my Lord grind, I saw people playing the Hood almost like a dive tank, constantly using the Void Walk to get into the enemy backline. Then you've got your traditional tank playstyle, which is how I mostly played him. And I've also seen some people play him more from the midline, using his guns and abilities to apply pressure without constantly being the first person into a fight. Though, I don't really think there's one single correct way to play him, which is really unique. I also really appreciate how easy his kit is to understand. I talked about this briefly in my Jubilee video, but sometimes I think Marvel Rivals benefits from having characters that don't require hours in the practice range just to get an understanding of what you're supposed to be doing. You can pick up the Hood, understand the basics of his kit, and immediately start playing. And finally, I love that his demon energy doesn't decay. You still need to be actively applying pressure to build it, but you aren't constantly being punished because you weren't shooting someone for 5 seconds. It means you can actually save your resources for the right moment. Now, for the part where I probably make some people angry, I don't think the Hood is a particularly great tank, and that's probably my biggest problem with him. He has 600 health, a relatively small personal shield, and a wall shield that can be broken pretty easily. So instead of feeling like a traditional tank, he often feels like a very large DPS. And that becomes especially noticeable when you're solo tanking. The Hood can absolutely make solo tanking work, but compared to other Vanguards, I think he struggles when the entire enemy team decides you're the target. A lot of other tanks have stronger self-preservation tools or abilities that provide more direct value to their team.
Current score is
The Hood has
3
some of that,
to
but I don't
3.
think he is quite enough. Personally, I'd like to see his health go from 600 to somewhere around the 650 to 675 range.
Final score
I'd also
4
be completely
to
fine with
3.
giving Abyssal Veil a little bit more health. 225 to 250, nothing major. And then I'd look at his personal shield. Either give it a slightly shorter cooldown or let it stay active for just a little longer. Nothing crazy. I don't want the Hood to become this unkillable monster. I just want him to actually feel like the Vanguard he's supposed to be. And there's his ultimate. I actually really like the concept. When you pull it off, it can be incredibly strong. But the problem is that it can also feel really awkward. Sometimes the enemy can just basically hide from you. And because you're relying on getting those shots lined up, it can feel like you activated your ultimate just to accomplish absolutely nothing. And maybe that's partially a skill issue. I'm willing to admit that. I definitely had moments where I probably could have positioned myself better, but there were also times where I would use his ability to fly up, activate my ultimate, which they did show in his gameplay trailer, and my camera would get stuck in something or get stuck behind a tree. So, definitely not the most intimidating demon gun experience. And with the Hood finally hitting level 20, I can add him to my Lord roster. And honestly, this grind made me realize something. I don't think I can do this for every new character. So, moving forward, I still want to review every new character that gets added to Marvel Rivals. But I'm only going to commit to the full Lord grind for characters that I genuinely enjoy. Because if I'm going to spend that many hours playing someone, I better actually like them. Characters like Nightcrawler, Ghost Rider, Mysterio, or Quicksilver. Absolutely. Those are characters I'd happily put myself through the grind for. But the Hood, let's just say that his Lord grind was definitely a humbling experience. Despite that, I still think the Hood is a really interesting addition to Marvel Rivals. He's a character I never expected to see added, and I think NetEase did a good job making him stand out. He's not perfect, and pretty far from it. I don't think he's currently one of the best tanks in game, but I do think he's fun, unique, and most importantly gives a lesser known Marvel character a chance to shine. And honestly, that's something I always want to see more of. What do you guys think? Do you think the Hood was a good addition to Marvel Rivals? Do you think he's actually a good Vanguard, or do you agree that he feels more like a DPS with a bigger health bar? And most importantly, would you put yourself through the Lord grind? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video.